Well, hello, everyone. This is Jeff Greenewald, chair of the History Consortium. I'm welcoming you to another of our programs on the Civil War and its effect on people and communities. And tonight we'll be talking about Mount Olivet Cemetery and Confederate graves there. And we're fortunate to have with us tonight Gary L. Dyson, who is a retired environmental specialist for the city of Gaithersburg in Maryland and a lifelong history enthusiast, and spent countless hours reading and researching and exploring battlefields, everything from the French and Indian War up to World War II, a pretty extensive interest in all periods of history. Gary owns a company, Dyson Genealogy and Historical Research. He's the author of several publications: The Ambush of Isaac P. Smith, a Civil War correspondent, New Orleans, the journals and reports of Albert, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Gary. It looks like Albert Gass, Hills of the Boston Journal, and 2 Maryland church histories. He has a BS in Natural Resources from Oregon State University and lives in Mount Airy, Maryland, with his wife, Emily, and it appears that he's very happy now that he's an empty nester. Well, you don't have to explain all that to us, Gary, but please tell us about the graves. Thanks.
All right, thanks a lot. First off, I have to say happy birthday, United States Marines. This is their 247th birthday. And as a veteran, I need to say that, otherwise I get in trouble. But I'll go right now into the presentation. My presentation is Confederate Row, the Confederate dead buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick, Maryland, 1862 to 1907. Give you a little background information about Mount Olivet Cemetery. It's located at 515 South Market Street in town. The final resting place for the Confederate dead from Frederick's wartime hospitals from before the Maryland Campaign in 1862, which is South Mountain, Sharpsburg, Gettysburg, Williamsport, Monocacy, Cedar Creek, and some other battles, and also includes many sick. The Union dead from the hospitals in Frederick during the Maryland Campaign and elsewhere were moved here and for their final resting place instead of a national cemetery after the war. Mount Olivet originated in 1852. It was dedicated in 1854, and the first burial was 5 days later, an older woman in town. It was gradually enlarged and grew as the older cemeteries and graveyards in town were needed for their space for more development in town. So the remains, the bodies were transported to Mount Olivet, which became Frederick's other city. And you can see it on the map. It's just south of Frederick. This is Bond's map of 1858 of Frederick County, and the cemetery is just in the center of the image, just below the main city lines. Frederick itself was of great strategic use and importance for the war. Based on its location, it was a very sizable town. There are lots of transportation resources. There are roads going out in every direction. Plus, you have the B&O Railroad heading right through town, east to Baltimore and west to Harper's Ferry and points westward. But during the war, Frederick became one vast hospital. There were 7 general hospitals in town. In 1862. By 1863, there was only one left, General Hospital Number 1, which was where the Hessian Barracks is now, where the Maryland School for the Deaf was after the Civil War. It was the only hospital. It was actually almost right across the street from Mount Olivet. I should make a comment that each general hospital, 7 hospitals, wasn't just one building. There were many buildings that would constitute an entire general hospital. The image on the right, I should say, is the one. This is Calvary Methodist Church in the center, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church next to it. This is, as example, this would be part of General Hospital Number 4. Now, there were the first arrivals in Frederick hospitals that wound up at Mount Olivet was a private J.E. Johnson, Company C, Mississippi Cavalry. His date of death was July 15th, 1862. On a stone, it says Tigers, but And this will be a common theme throughout identifying all these soldiers. There are many, many errors that were made regarding their records and even the names on the stone. For, say, Private Johnson in Mississippi Cavalry, there were no Mississippi Cavalry regiments operating in July 1862 in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. This was actually the 16th Mississippi Infantry. Private Jackson was shot in his lung in June, and he sent to General Hospital 1 in Frederick later. There were some 500 soldiers from Winchester who were captured when Jackson left the valley on his way to the 7 days battles around Richmond, and they were sent to Frederick as the Frederick Hospital. Now, the Confederate Army, this will be just for the Maryland campaign. Leading into the Maryland campaign, the Confederate Army had suffered over 20,000 casualties on the peninsula, plus Cedar Mountain and Second Manassas. The strength of Lee's army was down. Some troops with Lee's army didn't make it to Maryland until after Second Manassas. And some of these reduced regiments were made up of, the ranks were filled by conscripts. There were over 1,000 conscripts in the 1st, 3rd, 7th, and 48th North Carolina regiments alone. And of 400 conscripts in the 3rd North Carolina, only 100 made it to Maryland. So some of the troops coming into Maryland at this time during the Maryland campaign were not in the best physical condition. They had fought many battles, and there were a lot of stragglers. So as Lee's army crossed the Potomac in September 1862, they made it to Frederick within the 8th of September, and some of the soldiers coming in were sick, and some of those rebel soldiers were too sick to advance and became the first casualties in the hospitals and became the first soldiers on the road, Private Johnson being the first. First burials were, they had wooden headboards to identify the soldier as best they could. And identifications were based on whatever the hospital records were. But still errors would happen between all these chains, from the soldier being able to communicate or not be able to communicate their information to the hospital stewards, and from the records being transcribed for marking on the headboards. Just as an example, Barney Castile, he's on the list. Company D, Georgia Volunteers, died September 23rd, 1862. This would probably be a soldier who was died from the Battle of South Mountain. But there is no Barney Castile in the Georgia Volunteers. There is no regiment called Georgia Volunteers, or a lot of Georgia regiments that had numbers to them. And the only reference for Barney Castile I could find was a 72-year-old parson in Alabama. And I believe he survived, he was living at the end of the war. So who this person was, we'll just never know. And when these soldiers were buried, it wasn't really a given that they were going to stay there. They might be relocated to southern states later. And I should say there's at least one soldier on the row that is missing, Private S. Teagle, the 4th Alabama. He may have been removed and the record's just not kept or lost, but even the cemetery doesn't know what happened to him to this day. The first great pulse of soldiers coming through Frederick wounded were from the Maryland campaign. Most of the seriously wounded from the battles of South Mountain and Sharpsburg were left on the field. They were triaged, and as those who could make the trip were sent to Frederick. Frederick became, again, one vast hospital. Some survived long enough to arrive in Frederick, and some were there for months. There was even some soldiers who were there into the Gettysburg Campaign the following year. Families were notified through letters or officers after battle reports. Hometown newspapers would be able to communicate back home if their sons or fathers were on the casualty list. And a lot of mentioning back those conscripts, I've found in my research that many of these conscripts didn't have records at all. Some of them would be joining the Army as late as July, one even August 1862, joining his unit on the march, no paperwork follow-up. So those are the types of soldiers who would wind up as unknowns. The first soldiers arriving would be from the South Mountain battles. Fox's Gap, the brigades of Garland, Drayton, and Anderson are well represented on Confederate Row. Turner's Gap, just to the south, and Frosttown Plateau. Many wounded from Rhodes, Alabama Brigade and Evans, South Carolina Brigade are made up part of the row. Crampton's Gap, there are only two who were noted to be wounded at Crampton's Gap, but the units they were in were actually engaged on Maryland Heights. There was, everyone may have heard about Raisin Pitts. There's a soldier named Raisin Pitts on the row. There's no such soldier. There was a Drayton Pitts of the 6th Alabama Infantry, who was actually a lieutenant. So this is another error that happens when getting the name on the wooden marker. The only way, reasoning I can give for it, why the name came out as Raisin, if your name is Drayton and you're in a lot of pain and you have a very strong Southern Alabama accent, Drayton may come out as Raisin in the heat of the moment. Many of the specific units represent on the row from the 50th and 51st Georgia Infantry of Garland's brigade. And there was two brothers, Andrew and Emmanuel of the 50th Georgia, who are only six spaces away from each other on Confederate row. And what's curious about them is that they're when researching the U.S. Census reports from before the war, in the 1850 and 1860 U.S. censuses, no Andrew Schumann was found, but there was an Emmanuel Schumann. But there was an A. Schumann and an Alley Schumann. So I have to at least throw it out there, the possibility that Andrew was not Emmanuel's brother. Andrew may have been Emmanuel's sister, following her brother to war. And the very detailed examples of the wounding, the names, accurate descriptions of the wounds were given, especially in the Montgomery Weekly Advertiser of October 8th, 1862, describing the casualties of Rhodes Brigade. In my book, I tried to show where on the battlefields the soldiers received their wounds. Right now on the slide, you see two maps. These are from Brad Gottfried, who writes the Maps of series, Maps of Antietam, Maps of Gettysburg, and probably a dozen other Maps of books. He let me use his maps to show where these units were. That map on the left shows the area of the cornfield. And in the cornfield, in the very center, there's a lot of arrows pointing to one little unit, the 6th Georgia. The 6th Georgia was mauled severely in the cornfield at Sharpsburg on September 17th, 1862. And that's another regiment that's well represented on Confederate Row. And to the right is the famous Sunken Road or Bloody Lane. There are Alabama and Florida regiments in that slide, and Mississippi. But those Florida regiments especially, and the Alabamas, are well represented on Confederate Row. And of note, especially of interest to me, in the cornfield, it's the story of the 1st Texas Infantry in the cornfield is well known, lost over 80% of its casualties. But strangely, there are only 2 Texans on Confederate Row. Neither one of them is in the 1st Texas. And this is Elliott's grave map of 1864, showing the cornfield area. And I gave this as an example of why there were so many from the 6th. Georgia, at Casualties. Each one of those ticks where that yellow arrow is pointed is a single Confederate dead soldier, and that's right where the 6th Georgia was. To the right is what that area looks like today. And the sunken row, the same thing. On the left is what it looks like today. And on the right, you see where those Georgia and Florida and the North Carolina regiments were on the northern or eastern side of the row. Each one of those ticks is a Confederate soldier that was killed during the battle, or buried after the battle. So there are many soldiers on the row from the Maryland campaign. The next section of the row is for dead from Gettysburg. Now, most of the Gettysburg wounded from the battle were not sent to Frederick. They were sent elsewhere in Pennsylvania for treatment. But there were noticeably some from the Ewell's 2nd Corps represented on the row. They fought at Barlow's Knoll and Culp's Hill. In their records, they say that they were captured in Boonesboro. They weren't really captured in Boonesboro. Their wagons were captured at Monterey Pass and other places and sent to Boonesboro to be diverted to General Hospital 1 in Frederick. And next, well, almost at the end of the Gettysburg campaign, at Falling Waters, there are representatives on the row. 4 battle casualties and 1 soldier from a captured wagon. They were sent to a hospital in Hagerstown for a while, the female seminary in town. And from there, as the war went back into Virginia, they were transferred to Frederick and General Hospital number 1. The next area, our large number of soldiers on the row, were from Monocacy. And these, by now, all 6 of the general hospitals were gone. Only General Hospital number 1 remains. There are many more unknowns represented on the row from the Monocacy campaign and battle than from the Maryland campaign. And there were no hospital records found for the Monocacy deaths. The Monocacy regiments were horribly attrited by this time. Some brigades contained as many as 10 regiments by now. And in the ranks, there weren't just the infantry that had been fighting for so many years. Some of the Teamsters and support troops had been taken from their duties and put into these infantry units for Monocacy. And they also have wound up on the row. Most of the Confederate dead on the row were from the result of the attack of Gordon's division, especially Evans and York's brigades. In the main assault by Gordon coming across Monocacy River and attacking across the Worthington and Thomas farms on the battlefield. There were some casualties, though, at the fords and bridges around, even though there weren't main pushes to go across the rivers there. There were enough skirmishes, sharpshooters, and artillery back and forth that resulted in some casualties on the row. And I should say it wasn't just infantry being attrited away. McCausland's cavalry that day fought against the 8th Illinois Cavalry, and there are quite a few representatives from those battles on the row. And talking about Monocacy, one of the units that was heavily lost heavily at the battle is the 12th Georgia Light Artillery. Their casualties were listed in the Daily Constitutionalist of 28 July 1864. Many soldiers from this battalion are on the row. It was a battalion of 7 companies that had been in Charleston for most of the war, as Lee needed more numbers after the losses in Virginia during the Overland Campaign. 5 companies of the 12th were used as infantry and sent north. Their losses were 129 out of 232 engaged, and they were the names of some of those in the area in the bottom right of this slide. Some of the names of the soldiers who died from their wounds. Not all of them are mentioned on the row, but some are. So the ones that are on this list that didn't get a name on a grave probably occupy one of those unknown graves on the Confederate row. Reverend Lachlan Cummings Vass was of great help trying to identify these soldiers for the Monocacy battle. He was a chaplain for the 27th Virginia Infantry, which is one of the regiments in the Stonewall Brigade and Terry's Brigade. Stonewall Brigade, it was Terry's Brigade at Monocacy. But Reverend Vass cataloged all the sick and wounded in the hospitals. He was left behind after the Early's Army kept on marching on Washington. But he kept a very detailed list, and not just of the soldier's name, but their injuries, their ranks, companies, regiments, even their nearest post office and marital status. And some of these made Vass his other lists and internment lists from later. He was very good at noting not just who was in what grave, but in some cases, how many were in what grave. There are several graves on the row that have double occupancy, one grave and two stones. Now, Reverend Vass was later exchanged, sent back through the lines after the wounded had processed to the hospital at Frederick. Well, the last burials from the row were the battle at Cool Springs in the Shenandoah Valley. Private Allen, Company G, the 8th Virginia Cavalry. There's one from Cedar Creek, and two from Cedar Creek. Two were amputees, and one was shot in the lungs. There are the last four graves in a row. I just numbered them 300 through 303. They were casualties, but they were added to the row after 1927. I'll show an image of that, what that looks like then versus now. Where they were after the battle is an unknown, because they do later appear on the row with dates of death, which I don't think are accurate, but they may have been when they were placed there is not known. I should mention that two of those soldiers on this last four, Captain Morris and Lieutenant Samuel Pedro of Company D, 16th Virginia Cavalry, were great friends before the war, and they died in the same battle. Now, after the war, there were unknowns and knowns on the battlefield, but in 1869, Governor Bowie of Maryland decided to have a list made to describe where all these Confederate graves were in Maryland and their condition. And the intent was to have them moved to a more respectable place. After the war, these graves had been plowed, animals had been rummaging through them, and some were exposed and eroded away. So because they were not allowed to be buried at Antietam National Cemetery in Sharpsburg, the money was provided to have them buried at the Hagerstown, at the Washington Confederate Cemetery at Rose Hill Cemetery in Hagerstown. But there were still a few in the Monocacy area that really didn't make a whole lot of sense to move them to Hagerstown. But there was money allotted for Thomas Kiefer. Well, Kiefer Thomas, the owner of the Thomas farm. There were mass graves on his property. He was paid to have them removed to the mass grave at Monocacy. And those were part of the 407 unknowns in a mass grave there at the very end of the row. And there were some other graves. The last soldier on the row was Damascus Weatherly of the 2nd Florida Infantry. He was buried in 1907. He had left Frederick with his outfit, and at Braddock Heights, he became ill and died, and he was buried at a church there. But the church decided to use that property for a building expansion. So his remains were then removed to Mount Olivet. And he's actually, even though he was the last soldier placed there, he's actually the first soldier there next to Private Johnson. Just to give a burial breakdown by state on Confederate Row, there are 26 from Alabama, 3 from Arkansas, 8 from Florida, 86 from Georgia, 24 from Louisiana, 1 from Maryland, 10 from Mississippi, 57 from North Carolina, 35 from South Carolina, 1 from Tennessee, 2 from Texas, and 30 from Virginia. The 1 from Maryland, though, is a question mark because the Confederacy didn't have any Maryland infantry units engaged during the entire Maryland campaign. The only Maryland unit there was an artillery battery, as I recall, at Sharpsburg. So no soldier was found from Maryland with information that they died and was sent to Frederick for a hospital. It may be an error. He may be, he could even be a Union soldier from Maryland. There were Marylanders from fighting for the Union in the Maryland campaign. So his identity is a mystery. Now, after the years went by, those wooden headboards were starting to weather, and the Maryland legislature passed a bill to have more permanent markers put up, and to pay for the other remains to be brought there. The first stone monuments that you see were placed in the early 1870s. This is Confederate Row in 1927. There's the plaque for the 408 Union soldiers. We had 407 earlier. That marker you see to the right is for an unknown soldier. So those last 4 graves that I mentioned before have been placed to the left of that unknown soldier since 1927. And I couldn't find any records that show when that was done and where those bodies came from. Today, there are new monuments behind those first monuments. There's a row of modern monuments from the Veterans Administration from June. They were placed in June 1998 because those other markers were starting to weather as well. Now, not every soldier got a brand new marker. I put up the 2 for John Riley Osteen from Company C of the 50th Georgia, and Benjamin Stembridge from the 6th Georgia Infantry. Those stones may have been placed by family, but they were not placed, or they were not replaced with the more modern ones. The unknown stones on the row were paid for by reenacting group. And the unknowns on the row, the Ladies Confederate Memorial Association raised funds for that monument on the left, the soldier standing guard overlooking the last resting place for those soldiers. It was dedicated in 1881 for the 408. And I should mention that the unknown could be known. You'd never be able to find out which soldier was in which grave box or such. But if you did go through and check all the casualty lists from the battles and cross-check those with the names of those who were actually identified, you could get an accurate list of names that would be those unknown soldiers. And Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama would be excellent sources to start with. The first Remembrance Day that I have found to remember those soldiers was June 4th, 1870. It was an article in a Frederick newspaper, and they've been as late as 2005, 2017, but they're much more low-key these days. I should mention that the monument, I'm going to go back a slide, the soldier overlooking those unknowns, that monument was toppled just a couple of years ago by vandals in the park, and I don't think it can be repaired. And this is what Confederate Row looks like today. There's some of the old stones are starting to fall. and their flags are not placed in front of them anymore. There is a group called the Friends of Mount Olivet that goes and cleans stones, and also starting soon, will begin making repairs. So there's a plug for the Friends of Mount Olivet. Should mention some of the sources used for my research. The cemetery records, the Mount Olivet Cemetery has a very good inventory of the names of the soldiers there and some information about them. Service records were very useful. The official records were very useful, especially when a certain soldier was noted in an official report. Brad Gottfried's maps were very useful to determine where a soldier fell on the battlefield. County maps, burial maps, regimental histories, brigade histories, pension records tell a lot of the plight of the family after the soldier died and trying to get back pay, and also gave names and important data. Unit rosters, period newspapers. Some of the newspapers were more graphic than others. Some newspapers would just barely report, just give a name and say dead, wounded. Some, like Louisiana, would be extremely graphic and would say head shot off, arm lost, or shot in the bowels, and more graphic and descriptive, graphic descriptions of the wounds. Some diaries and battle histories. One Vast Hospital by Terry Reamer, it gives a very detailed list of all those soldiers when they came into hospitals and when they left. And of course, the ones at Frederick Row went one way. Of course, census reports, slave schedules, marriage records. These I use to give the story of a soldier before they went into the Army. So I tell about the soldier, their genealogy, their history in the war, and talk about their wounds and medical records when they're available. So that's the end of my presentation. I should say Confederate Row is for sale on lulu.com, as well as another book I've written since then called Beyond the Bowie List, which does the same kind of a study of all the Maryland soldiers who were named but buried in those fields of Sharpsburg and on the banks, on the slopes of South Mount. So at this time, if anyone has any questions, let's see. Jeff Greenwald, Lee's army was hardly met with welcome by the people in the Frederick area. How do the citizens respond to the Confederate patients in their town? While Frederick was a Union town, there were plenty of Southern sympathizers, very substantial families, and they would help treat some of the soldiers, especially in Confederate Hospital, General Hospital number 7, which housed all Confederate soldiers. Some townspeople went as far as Hagerstown trying to help soldiers after the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Union Army or authorities would arrest them and send them to prison at Fort McHenry for a time to test their loyalties and keep them there until they made some kind of a loyalty oath to the Union. Jeff says, interesting that Confederate monument went up in the 1880s as a reconciliation was in full swing and Jim Crow laws took hold. How are these graves viewed today? Well, there's been some vandalism on some of the graves, and the flag isn't. There's no Confederate flags are put out in front of them anymore. I view them as soldiers who fought for a cause. Why? And I try to explain with their background without making any kind of a judgment why they went and fought. Some were from the families of slaveholders, but there were also a number of conscripts. There were so many farmers in North Carolina in 1862 in their 30s who had no intention of serving in the war, but because of the Conscription Act of 1862, were sent to war anyway. So my intent was to tell the stories of how they got to where they are today. Yes. Okay.
In your research, did you find any descendants of these soldiers? Trace them back to where they came from, people that are still alive in their family?
Occasionally, I would find a descendant that would send a picture, or there was one man I met whose son came to Frederick. He was in Frederick during the war, and he met Lieutenant Colonel Watkins, I believe the 15th South Carolina Infantry. He was mortally wounded on South Mountain, but he went to a Frederick hospital, and he died there. But he was still there. I hope I got the story right. But when his family came up after the war to see their ancestor's grave, he was here and was able to tell them about his last days, last hours, and where he was on the row. I would say Lieutenant Colonel Watkins is the highest ranking soldier on the row. Okay.
Well, I think I don't see any other questions posted,
Nope.
Gary, but thanks very much for your presentation. We do appreciate it. And I want to remind everyone that tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, our final program in our week of presentations on the Civil War and its impact on people and communities. And we will have quite an impact story. And that was the impact of the burning of Chambersburg on the citizens who lived there and how they recovered. So please join us for the premiere of that video tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. And thanks so much. This is Jeff Greenewalt, Chair of the History Consortium, thanking all you folks and thanking all our speakers for making this such a successful week. And we've got one more night to go. Please join us. Thanks very much.